I'm going to first kind of talk about, of course, the rise of fascism. We'll kind of get into that topic first, like Hitler, Mussolini, and all that, and then I'll get into talking about World War II, and then I'll kind of spend a little time also talking about all the different kinds of questions and topics that, of course, that are on Cold War also as well. So here we go. Of course, some of the questions I've got listed, of course, from our previous study guide that I had up in Canvas, but it says, what was the outcome of the German Revolution of 1918-1919? Well, after World War I in Germany, there was a revolution which overthrew the Kaiser Wilhelm II. And so afterwards, as you know, the Germans created the so-called Weimar Republic, I think by 1919. And so Germany became like this, democratic republic afterwards, which will be around until 1933. The Weimar Republic was a type of government which originally was based in Weimar, Germany. And it was a government where they, of course, had two heads of state. They had, of course, the president, which is more of a ceremonial position, and then they had the chancellor, which was like a prime minister. They had, I think the two first prime ministers I made a mention about this were Frederick Ebert, and they had later on Paul von Hindenburg, that would later rule afterwards. And later Hitler came in and combined the two positions together during the period of the Third Reich and all that. The Weimar's around, but like I said, it failed later, which I'll kind of get into too as well. That leads into, Adolf Hitler, rising to power eventually in Germany. What economic situations caused the decline of the Weimar Republic? Well, after World War I, the Germans had to pay a lot of, war reparations, like something like $32 billion. So that hurt their economy. Also, they had as well a lot of debts to owe from the war. Germany had lost a lot of their colonies, and so a lot of that kind of allowed the rise of these more extremist groups to come into power. And then when the Great Depression happened, in the 1930s, that was a big thing as well. Also, if you know about it, in the 1920s, they had that hyperinflation period where also German currency wasn't worth any money either. What is fascism? What are some components of it that are common with these kind of dictatorships? Well, fascism is a type of extreme right ideology that became popular between World War I and World War II. And fascists believed in reestablishing their state as a major power, extreme nationalism. Also, they wanted to build up a military. They tended to suspend certain kind of civil liberties. So lack of democracy, usually under fascist regimes. And most of them are led by totalitarian dictators like a Mussolini or Hitler. And then, of course, some people think that Francisco Franco in Spain was also kind of similar to that somewhat. So those are all examples of different fascists, of course, we'll talk about today, of course. Spanish Civil War, that was a civil war that broke out in 1936 to 39, where you had the so-called Republican forces fighting the nationalist forces. And what happened was Francisco Franco, who was a general in the Spanish army, seized control of the state, and it created a civil war. And one side, you had the Republican side versus the nationalists, and the Republicans were backed by the Soviet Union, communists and anarchists, and the nationalists, of course, of Franco, basically were on the other side. We were kind of seen as being more, I guess, semi-fascist somewhat. They eventually won the war. The Spanish Civil War is kind of like a proving ground for Italy's and Germany's armed forces that began to fight there prior to World War II breaking out later. It was Benito Mussolini. What political party did he develop in Italy? Mussolini, of course, was a famous fascist who seized power in Italy in the 1920s. He had this political party called the Fascist Italian Party. I guess they called it different names, or PNF, I think they called it also as well. And in 1922, with the so-called March on Rome, Mussolini was able to seize power And anyway, as you know, Mussolini adopted the fasci as his main symbol of his movement. The fasci was, if you know about it, originated from ancient Rome. It was a symbol of, I think, power and authority of those in power. And Mussolini also used these paramilitary forces like the black shirts to basically, I guess, seize power and take control of the state. And they're kind of compared sometimes to Hitler's SA, or brown shirts that were in Germany. The March on Rome happened in October 1922. There was a period of like a week or so where they had this demonstration against the government where basically they said, if you don't put Mussolini in power, we're just going to overthrow the government or we'll have a civil war. And so basically Mussolini was put in as prime minister and rules the country until 1943. Of course, he becomes this fascist dictator that really becomes like a Hitler too later. And he went by the title Il Duce, of course, the Duke or the leader. All right, moving on. Let's also talk about Adolf Hitler. Adolf Hitler, of course, seized power, of course, in eventually Germany. And Hitler was an Austrian native who had been a World War I veteran, and he founded eventually the so-called Nazi Party, National Socialist German Workers' Party. And its main symbol eventually was, of course, the so-called Swiss swastika. Who were some leaders that were under Hitler? I talked about the head of the Luftwaffe, who was Hermann Goering. He was one of Hitler's top leaders. He was real famous later in World War II. They also had Heinrich Himmler, who was the head of the SS, or Schutzstaffel, which was this security apparatus of Nazi Germany. Later, they were known as the Black Shirts. And of course, you know about Heinrich Himmler. He was also the head of the Gestapo, the Nazi Germany's secret police. And the SS was involved, in the Holocaust and all that, of course, later. They also had the SA, the brown shirts, Nazi stormtroopers, they sometimes called them too. And those were led by Ernest Röhm. Sturmabteilung, I think, meant storm detachment or something like that. And it was like a paramilitary force of Hitler. That was originally, I think, Hitler's bodyguards and all that. I think I talked about Joseph Goebbels, the head of propaganda and all of that. I think, and Martin Bormann, who was one of Hitler's personal secretaries that ran the Chancellery building and all that. What was the Beer push? That was a attempted coup by Hitler to seize control of Munich, Bavaria in November of 1923, but it failed. And he ended up being put in prison and all that. And so Hitler, when he was in prison, about in Germany, wrote the famous book Mein Kampf, which was kind of like an autobiography, but it kind of outlined like a lot of the things that the Nazis were going to do when they seized power in Germany. Why did the Nazis become popular in the 1930s? A lot of it had to do with the Great Depression, the fact that there were so many people, like 6 million people or so, that were unemployed. And so people started to listen to Hitler and his ideas. And so because of the fact that the Nazis became popular and Hitler was the leader of the Nazi Party, he decided to run for the president of Germany in 1932. And he lost to Paul von Hindenburg, who was the incumbent president of Germany. However, because of the fact that the Nazis had gotten kind of a majority in the so-called German parliament, Hitler was made chancellor of Germany on January 30th, 1933. Some people think that's when Nazi Germany kind of starts, which is sometimes called also the Third Reich as well. So 1933 to 1945, that's basically when the Nazis will kind of seize control of the country, and it's going to lead to World War II later. What was the Enabling Act of 1933? They had that in the Reichstag fire decree. Both these were events that occurred because of the Reichstag fire. It happened in February of 1933. That was where this man named van der Lubbe had burned down the German Parliament building, and Reichstag building, they call it now. Anyway, the Nazis basically took total control of the government, and they banned all political parties except Nazis, and they made Hitler a dictator, basically, with totalitarian powers. And so within 1 year, from 1933 to 1934, Germany was converted into this totalitarian one-party state, run by the Nazis. After Hindenburg died, what title does Hitler adopt, which combines the presidency and the chancellorship together? The Führer, or Der Führer, which of course means leader also as well. What was the Night of the Long Knives? That was a period where between June to July of 1934, Hitler purged the Nazi party of people that were kind of like enemies of him, people that were also liberal, that were in the party. And he killed off Ernest Röhm, who was the head of the SA, and took the SA and combined it with the military, all that. So he was trying to consolidate his power, basically. Some people call it the so-called Röhm push, Nazi blood purge. It's called all kinds of things. But after that, Hitler had, total power, over Nazi Germany. Why was Hitler able to rearm Germany and begin expanding the Third Reich? That was due to the fact that the Western powers were weak after World War I. The League of Nations was really not that powerful. And also the fact that the West preferred to use appeasement to stop aggression rather than actual war. What region of Western Germany did Hitler occupy in 1936 and the West didn't do anything to stop him? The Rhineland. He just marched in there, took it over. Who are the Axis powers? The Axis powers later become the allies that fight against the Allied powers in the war. These are the countries that are Germany, Italy, and also Japan, that were all the fascist powers in the world that fought the Allied powers later, which were mostly later, if you know about it, Britain, Soviet Union, China, the United States, and briefly France as well. Those like the majority of the ones that fought, of course. What was Anschluss? March 1938. That was where the Nazis marched into Austria, annexed it into the Third Reich. Anschluss means, I think, joining German. That's something Hitler wanted to do, of course, because he's from Austria. What region of Czechoslovakia must cause World War II to break out in 1938? That, of course, was the Sudetenland, which was the western part of Czechoslovakia. It creates the so-called Sudeten crisis. And what happened was it leads to the so-called Munich Conference, where Britain, France, Italy, Germany meet in Munich, Bavaria, to decide what to do about this issue. And so what happened was, as you know, the West decided to give away the Sudetenland, the western part of Czechoslovakia, to Nazi Germany to avoid World War II. And this was seen as a form of appeasement. About it, the Prime Minister of Britain, Neville Chamberlain, summed it up with his famous quote, I believe it's peace for our time. And of course, this ends up being, an erroneous statement later, as you know. Then what happened right prior to World War II breaking out, about it, Nazi Germany and what is the Soviet Union formed kind of this non-aggression pact together, which was also called the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. That's the other name. And it was basically a deal made where they wouldn't fight for 10 years against each other. And so they wouldn't fight for 10 years. Also, Germany in exchange would basically give the Soviets half of Poland, the eastern half. And then also the Soviets were given control of the Baltic states. That's kind of above Poland. And the reason why the Nazi-Soviet pact was important was because Hitler and Nazi Germany did not have to fight a two-front war when World War II broke out. It's obviously one of the things that helped to cause World War II in the end. What incident started World War II on the date of September 1st, 1939? Of course, Nazi Germany invaded Poland. And so that touched off World War II, with Britain and France declaring war. What nickname described Germany's offensive warfare at the beginning of World War II, especially from like 39 to maybe 41, 42? It was known as Blitzkrieg, because the fact that the Germans would use a lot of offensive type components like tanks and aircraft, mobilize, trucks and things like that to take vast amounts of land. And it means lightning war. And so, as you know, within like a month, Poland's overrun pretty quickly, and Soviets take over the eastern part as well. What was the Phony War? Just spelled different ways. Phony War was this kind of lull in the war, last between 1939 and 1940. After the fall of Poland, not much happened during the Phony War, except I think, if you know about it, Germany took over Denmark and Norway. They also had some naval campaigns going on, I think, at that time. But between then, Hitler was basically working on an invasion plan, of course, which, the Poland one was Case Yellow, of course, and then, of course, the one Case White, that was the invasion of, what they call the West. And actually, I'm sorry, I got that reversed there. Case White was the invasion of Poland, and then Case Yellow was the invasion of the West. Anyway, what happened was the Germans broke through the Ardennes force, which is in like Belgium and part of France, which was really the weakest link on the Western Front. And what happened was the British and the French their force got cut in half. And so what happened was it formed this Allied pocket that they called the Dunkirk pocket formed in northern France and also part of Belgium. And so the British were forced to evacuate their forces. So they later called that the Miracle of Dunkirk, was often called the Operation Dynamo, which happened in May, June of 1940. And so that basically forced the British out at that time. And then they had the Battle of France, which is all this is pretty much May, June. You have the Battle of France, where the German forces invade France. And within just a few weeks, like 4 or 5 weeks, France falls to Nazi Germany. So they're pretty quickly, it was pretty much mopped up, France at that point. What were the main surrender terms put on France by Germany at the end of the war? Well, the French, basically their country was cut in half. The northern part was what they call occupied France. And then the southern part was what they call Vichy France, which was basically this pro-Nazi state that they put in power around Vichy, which is in southern France. And then the occupied France had Paris. It was like an open city they had. The Germans occupied the north. Later in the south, they occupied the southern part, I think, by the end of the war. But that's how they divided up. And then they also had the Free France as well. That was basically a French government exile that was led by Charles de Gaulle, who was a French general that fled France after they lost the battle of France. And the Free French forces, of course, would fight along the Allied powers in the war. They later invade during D-Day with them, allies later. And they're the ones that backed, like the French resistance movement. Who becomes Prime Minister of Great Britain after Neville Chamberlain steps down in May of 1940? He's actually ill, but I think obviously it was that too. But that would be Winston Churchill, who, of course, is prime minister throughout pretty much the whole war until 1945. Well, after that, you had the Battle of Britain that came next. The Battle of Britain, of course, was a famous air battle that took place between the British Royal Air Force and the German Luftwaffe. Hitler, of course, next wanted to invade Britain. And so he had this operation he developed called Operation Sea Lion, which was supposed to be planned as some kind of amphibious invasion of Britain. But because of the fact that the Luftwaffe wasn't able to take out the British Royal Air Force, and the fact that they lost so many planes trying to attack Britain, that they eventually abandoned the invasion of Britain. So Operation Sea Lion never happened. You know about that. What was the strategy the RAF had with attacking the German Luftwaffe? Well, they obviously they divided Britain into sectors, like with their air force, and using radar, they were able to attack, certain, bogies of planes coming in. And so that kind of gave them advantage. It also had an advantage, the fact that all they had to do is fly over Britain or the English Channel, whereas German planes had to fly from longer distances, from France or Norway or whatever. And so that was a big advantage that they had. What was the Blitz? The Blitz was where the Germans began bombing London and other cities in England during the war, to kind of, I guess, terror bombing to get the British to capitulate against the Germans. At one point, they bombed, I think, for almost like 2 months straight. They bombed London, but they kept bombing them, throughout the war. I know, and of course, a lot of British died. If you know that, in the Blitz, I think the number was something like 50,000 actually died. What was Operation Barbarossa? Barbarossa was of course, the secret code name for Nazi Germany's invasion of the Soviet Union, which started in June 1941. And of course, this opened up the so-called Eastern Front. The Eastern Front was basically the bloodiest front in World War II, between basically the Soviet Union, Germany, and whatever Axis powers that fought with Germany on the Eastern Front. And what happened was on June 22nd, 1941, the Germans invaded with something like 3-4 million troops. It was like the largest invasion, I think, in history they talk about. And the Germans took over eastern Poland. They overrun the Baltic states. They took over the Ukraine. And they pushed their forces deep into western Russia. And eventually, the Germans laid siege to Leningrad, which, by the way, they laid siege to it for almost 800 days, just over 2 years. One of the longest sieges, I guess, in modern times. And the Soviets later called the Eastern Front against the Nazis, they call it the Great Patriotic War. This name came from the fact that they nicknamed that kind of similar name when they fought Napoleon in 1812. They call it the Patriotic War. So they call it the Great One, Great Patriotic War, basically. But yeah, the casualties were ridiculous. I think combined, they had like 20 million or more. They were killed on the Eastern Front. 20, 30 million, I think, actually. Because I think the Soviets had like 20 million soldiers and civilians that got killed in the war. And all that. And so Eastern Front was the bloodiest front probably in the war. And yeah, it's Stalingrad, one of the bloodiest battles probably in modern history or all history totally. What were some main causes why the United States entered World War II? Well, obviously it was because of Japanese aggression in Asia and the Pacific, but the main cause of why we got in the war was because the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor on December 7th, 1941. Some earlier causes, though, was obviously the fact that Japan was trying to take over Asia. They had control of Taiwan and Korea at that point. But in 1931, they took over Manchuria. And then in 1937, as you know, they also invaded mainland China, like the eastern part of it. So-called Second Sino-Japanese War that breaks out, which was considered the second bloodiest front probably in World War II. They think the Chinese lost like 10 million people in the war, something like that. And the United States began giving military support to the Chinese Republican Forces general, whose name was Chiang Kai-shek, who I talked about before. So we supported them. I think we may have supported the communist side, Mao Zedong, but we weren't really crazy about him as much. Then the U.S. also sent volunteer American pilots to go fight with the Chinese Air Force. This became known as the Flying Tigers, also known as the AVG, or American Volunteer Group. And so they were sent over there in 1941-42, I guess, to fight basically with the Chinese. Claire Chennault was the guy that led the Flying Tigers, who I think went to Louisiana State University at one point. What famous event occurred on December 7th, 1941? That, of course, the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor with their so-called First Air Fleet, which was a massive aircraft carrier fleet that they used to attack Hawaii. And what was the primary target? What famous Japanese admiral planned the initial attack on the United States? That was Admiral Yamamoto, who was the head of the Imperial Japanese Navy. Primary target, of course, was Pearl Harbor, where we had our main Pacific fleet there on Oahu. And they went mostly after Battleship Row, which back in those days, battleships was the big thing, not carriers at that point. And they destroyed or damaged something like 18 ships or more. Close to 3,000 men were killed. And U.S. battleship, as you know, the USS Arizona was hit the worst with 80% casualties. Yeah, Arizona went down and destroyed it. Now it's a memorial, of course, at that site. So that caused the United States to declare war on Japan, which happened the next day, December 8th, 1941. And now on top of that, you had Italy, Germany declare war on us also as well. What were some turning point battles of World War II in 1942 that led to the Allies causing the decline of the Axis powers? There's three big battles they talk about that are big. They had the Battle of El Alamein, especially the second one, October 1942. They had the Battle of Stalingrad on the Eastern Front, August 1942 to about February 1943. And then they had the Battle of Midway in the Pacific between the U.S. and Japanese navies, which was June 1942. What German general did the British General Bernard Montgomery defeat at the Second Battle of El Alamein? That was, of course, Erwin Rommel, who was known as the Desert Fox. And he had this army that he built up, of course, in North Africa, so-called North Africa campaign, which was called the Africa Corps, which was like this kind of a tank army or something, like mobilized army. And the Germans tried to, seize Egypt, if you know about that. It was one of the main goals of the North African campaign for the Africa Corps. But eventually they were defeated at the Battle of El Alamein in northwestern Egypt. Montgomery, who was also called Monty sometimes. Operation Torch also was in World War II. Operation Torch was this American operation where the U.S. forces invaded into Morocco and Algeria, which was controlled by the Vichy French, and it was led by Dwight Eisenhower and George Patton, and it was successful. In Operation Torch was kind of important because it helped to basically cut off Rommel's forces in the west with the British in the east in North Africa, and eventually it forced Rommel out of North Africa with a German defeat by 1943. Why was the Battle of Stalingrad important? On Stalingrad was, of course, the most pivotal battle on the Eastern Front. And what happened was the Germans in 1942 attempted like a second offensive to try to seize Stalingrad and also the Volga River Basin, send southwestern Russia. And what happened was the German forces got encircled in the winter of 1942-43, and it turned to a rout, and it caused basically eventually the Soviets to push the Germans back. And the Germans never recovered from Stalingrad. They pretty much lost the war after that. In fact, the Germans didn't win too many battles after that. So at that point, they were winning everything, and then they started losing. Operation Husky, what was that? That was basically the Allied invasion of Sicily, which was led by the British and the Americans, led by Patton and Montgomery. And what happened was the Allied forces seized Sicily as a stepping off to invade Italy, which started the Italian campaign, which lasted until 1945. And what happened was it forced Mussolini to step down as prime minister of Italy. So he was out. And the Italians switched to the Allied side. They didn't want to back the Axis any powers anymore because it looks like Hitler's starting to lose. And so what happened was the Germans kept fighting in the war because they didn't want to do, I guess, like what Churchill thought they could do, which was they thought that, Italy was the underbelly of the Nazi Germany, and they were going to just go up through, Italy into Austria. And so Hitler fought a, defensive type war in Italy under Albert Kesselring, and that's why, Italy turns into this kind of bloody conflict. But I wouldn't worry as much about Italy on the test. Then you had the D-Day invasion, or just D-Day as they call it today. That was the Allied invasion, of course, of occupied France, which is often called Operation Overlord. Of course, happened on the famous date of June 6, 1944. Involved mostly British and American forces, along with some other minor forces. I think the Canadians, the French, Polish, and a few other forces also fought as well. But I think almost 2/3 of the forces were American. And D-Day was actually led by Dwight Eisenhower. He was pretty much the head of the forces. And the code name for the Allied invasion, by the way, was Operation Overlord, although the actual plans were called Operation Neptune. Operation Bodyguard was this deceptive plan by the Allied powers to fool Nazi Germany on the landing location of the invasion, which was Normandy, France. And so they made all these deals where they create fake invasion plots, like different locations. And one location I know was Dover, across from Calais in northern France. And so they created a bunch of fake armies using bogus, like inflatable tanks and things like that used to kind of trick people into thinking it was a real army. And the United States had one army called the First U.S. Army Group that was a bogus army that wasn't real. To trick, Hitler and all that. What landing beaches did the Allies invade at starting D-Day? Well, the United States landed at Omaha and Utah, and then, of course, at Juno, Sword, and Gold, you had the Canadian British forces came ashore there. So those are and I told you how a lot of the landing craft that they used were developed by Andrew Higgins from New Orleans, Louisiana. And so without him, we wouldn't be able to have all these amphibious battles in Europe and in the Pacific. And of course, Hitler was so impressed, he thought he was like the new Noah, is what he called him, like from the book of Genesis. Battle of Falaise-Poplar Gap was one of the strategic battles that was in the Battle of Normandy, which was also called Operation Overlord. And what happened was the Allied forces encircled Hitler's forces that were west of Paris, and they were forced to flee east or be annihilated. And it led to the fall of Paris in late August 1944. And so Paris fell. So Rome and Paris had pretty much fallen at that point in the war. July 20 plot, Operation Valkyrie. That was an attempted assassination on Hitler that was done by a bunch of officers, ring of officers in the German Wehrmacht. And it was led by this guy named Klaus von Stauffenberg, who brought a bomb, if you know about this, to one of Hitler's headquarters at East Prussia, a place called Rastenburg, so-called Wolf's Lair. And the bomb failed to kill Hitler, as you know. And so Hitler stayed in power to 1945. So I don't know what would happen if they would have killed Hitler, but it could have shortened the war. What was the Battle of the Bulge? Battle of the Bulge, or sometimes called the Operation Watch on the Rhine, or Ardennes. Well, that was a famous winter offensive battle where German forces fought against mostly American forces in the Ardennes forest. In December of 1944, Hitler launched a surprise offensive, hoping to split the Americans and British in half and drive them back into the sea. And what happened eventually was that it formed a huge bulge in the Allied lines, which is why they called it that, Battle of the Bulge. But the battle failed, but it was considered one of the bloodiest American battles that the United States fought in Europe that and the Battle of Normandy. Those two were the two bloodiest battles we fought total in the United States. Who was the last major battle fought in the city? Well, after the Allies invaded Germany, they had the Battle of Berlin that was fought April, May of 1945. That should be, by the way. And what happened with that was Berlin fell to the Soviets. And of course, after that, the Germans started surrendering, supposedly after Hitler committed suicide. And that led to VE Day, which is basically Victory in Europe Day, when the Germans began surrendering to the Allies, which is May 8th, 1945. So pretty much the war's over in Europe, but they did have the Pacific Campaign that also followed as well from 1941 to 45. That was where the United States fought Japan, mostly in the Pacific. And basically, they had different battles that were kind of important. One of the most important battles in the war was in 1942. It was one of those turning point battles I talked about. It was big. And that was the Battle of Midway, where near the Central Pacific, the U.S. Navy defeated the Japanese Navy in a decisive battle, where we sunk 4 of their aircraft carriers. And so that actually turned the tide in the war. And Japan never really recovered from that. It would take a long time for us to, defeat them. Another 3 years or so to defeat them. But in a sense, it was kind of a thing that changed the war. After that, the United States changed strategies. Our U.S. strategy, of course, to defeat the Japanese was the so-called island hopping strategy or leapfrogging strategy, where we basically jumped from island to island to take back strategic islands in the Pacific. As we went east to west across the Pacific. Now, I told you MacArthur and Admiral Chester Nimitz had their own, policies they wanted to do. Nimitz wanted to attack the Central Pacific to get to Japan, and then MacArthur wanted to attack the Southern Pacific to take the Philippines. So they had these two different ideas they had. Famous islands were taken back by the U.S. forces. Of course, the Solomon Islands was one of the first we took back. That led to the Battle of Guadalcanal, 1942 to 43. So you had that. You had the island of Tarawa and the Gilberts. So you had that, Battle of Tarawa, 1943. Philippines fell in 1944. Of course, Battle of the Philippines, which was actually one of the bloodiest conflicts that was in the Pacific, up there with Iwo Jima in Okinawa. Then you've got also the the Marianas Islands, of course, are considered really the most important, like Saipan, Guam, Tinian. Those would be very vital, of course, in the war because the United States used them to attack Japan from the air. They set up air bases there where they can, of course, attack Japan and all that. Then, of course, in 1945, you had the two most famous battles. You had where you had Iwo Jima, Operation Detachment, where U.S. Marines seized the volcanic island of Iwo Jima, which they were hoping to use it as a kind of a bomber base for B-29s or whatever. They were coming back from Japan that had to land there for emergency reasons. And so the U.S. Marines, that was considered one of the most famous battles that the Marine Corps ever had. It's in their, in their Marine Corps hymn. And Iwo Jima, of course, is very famous for the so-called American flag raising on Mount Suwabachi, which is considered one of the most iconic pictures ever taken, in World War II. Then Battle of Okinawa, Operation, I think it's called Iceberg, of course, was the last major battle in the Pacific. And what happened was the United States, over a period of like around 3 months, seized control of Okinawa, which was one of their home islands, which they were going to use to invade Japan, so-called Operation Downfall. Anyway, the Japanese put up a bloody fight, but eventually overwhelmed them after high casualties. So Okinawa was considered to be the bloodiest battle that the United States fought in the Pacific. Over all of them. What was the Manhattan Project? The Manhattan Project was, of course, the secret project by most of the United States to build an atomic bomb, which was like a super weapon, which was going to initially be used on Germany, but eventually it was used on Japan because Germany had dropped out of the war. Leslie Groves was an American general that ran the project. He managed the Manhattan Project at Los Alamos, New Mexico. And if I remember correctly, he was a U.S. Army Corps of Engineer general that had built the Pentagon, the U.S. Defense Building, prior to that. So he was famous for both those, for developing the Pentagon and also managing the Manhattan Project. Who was the American physicist who they hired to build the atomic bombs at Los Alamos? That, of course, was J. Robert Oppenheimer, who people later called the father of the atomic bomb, believe it or not. And they would go on to build like 3 bombs at that point. And the first bomb was called the Gadget. It was tested initially July 1945 on Alamogordo, New Mexico, the so-called Trinity test, as they dub it. And of course, it of course proved to be successful. Then they had 2 more bombs, as you know. They had one called Little Boy and one called Fat Man, as you know. And the first one, Little Boy, was dropped on Hiroshima on August 6, 1945. And the famous plane that dropped it, as you know, was the plane B-29 Superfortress, the Enola Gay. Sort of the most famous plane in World War II. The other city that was an atomic bomb, the second bomb, of course, was Fat Man, was dropped on the second city of Nagasaki 3 days later, August 9, 1945. And so they do think that the dropping of the atomic bombs helped to, shorten the war. They believe. I think also the Soviets coming into the war too also shortened it. And so that led to the Japanese surrendering to the Allies eventually in Asia Pacific on VJ Day, or Victory over Japan Day, which is usually around August 15th, 1945. A little over 2 weeks later, the Japanese then officially surrendered on September 2nd, 1945, in Tokyo Bay. So that ended the war. What was the Holocaust? The Holocaust was just a nickname, or Shoah, they call it too, for the Nazi Germany's genocide of Jews and other peoples throughout Europe during World War II, which they estimated they killed anywhere from 10 to 15 million people in Europe because of all the war. How many Jews were estimated to have been killed? It's kind of a debate, but as much as 6 million may have been killed by the Nazis in World War II. Auschwitz-Birkenau, that was the most infamous of the death camps, but the Germans had numerous death camps they built, of course, mostly in Poland. They also had various concentration camps elsewhere, like in Germany as well. What are the Nuremberg trials? The Nuremberg trials, of course, were these wartime trials that they had, of course, in Germany after the war, in Bavaria. And several Nazis were tried for war crimes, like Hermann Goering, who was the most famous, and a bunch were actually put to death or imprisoned for it. They did the same thing also for basically the Japanese, like Tojo. So that's basically those sections on World War II in fascism. Let me also for a little bit review as well on the ones that have to deal with the Cold War. We probably won't have as many on the Cold War. I'd say I just have more or less on the other sections, but I'll kind of go through those and look at those also as well. Let's see. So we got these right here. It says, what was the Cold War? The Cold War. The Cold War era was an era where basically there was a kind of a geopolitical standoff that occurred between the United States and the Soviet Union, which were the only 2 superpowers that were still left in the world. And so they kind of went toe to toe. And of course, politically, they were different. Where we were, democratic, more capitalist, and then they were more communist. So those kind of differences kind of helped to make a difference. And of course, a lot of it was, of course, because of the fact that the Soviets started taking over Eastern Europe and all that, which kind of was a problem. What was the United Nations that formed after? Oh, and by the way, the Cold War, another big thing that was part of it was the threat of nuclear war. because the fact that both U.S. Soviet Union got into an arms race, and it could have caused World War III to break out, and so that was another thing that could have. It was a Cold War. The fact that it wasn't really a real war, but it could have turned into one. What was the United Nations that formed after World War II? The UN, of course, was this international governmental peacekeeping organization that was created by the winning allies after World War II, with headquarters in New York, right? And of course, it includes the famous Security Council that runs it, maintains a lot of its policies. And I told you the UN had a lot to do with what caused the Cold War, because oftentimes, the big five, U.S., Britain, France, would be at odds with Soviet Union and the People's Republic of China during the Cold War. And so that became an issue. Of course, the other big issue was Germany being occupied and divided after World War II, what you see there. And Germany was split into 4 sectors. So you had Britain, France, U.S. Controlled like the western part of Germany, which became later West Germany, 1949. And then the Soviet Union controlled the eastern sector, which became later East Germany in 1949. So you get this deal where Germany split in half. And I told you that they also did the same thing to Berlin. Berlin was divided too. West Berlin was controlled by the Soviets. East Berlin was controlled by the U.S., Britain, and France. So that helped to really cause, basically the beginning of the Cold War. Who coined the term Iron Curtain? That was coined by Winston Churchill, who came to America 1947 and gave a speech about how basically Eastern Europe was going communist because of the Soviets. And so people often would use that term to describe, the communist areas of Europe as being behind the Iron Curtain and all that. What was the Truman Doctrine issued by the U.S. at the beginning of the Cold War? It was around 1947 too. And this was a doctrine associated with Harry S. Truman in the late 40s. And what the Americans decided to do was they decided to try to have a containment policy where they would try to contain communism and prevent it from spreading and all of that. And so that's what we did. And the Marshall Plan was kind of an extension of that. The Economic Recovery Plan, as they also called it, done between 1948 to 51, was this policy where the United States gave economic military aid to Western Europe to prevent it from going communist and to get them back on their feet after the war. And so that was a big part of what caused the split too. So Western part becomes like the Western Bloc, and the Soviets and Eastern Europe becomes the Eastern Bloc. What was the Berlin blockade, Berlin airlift, 1948-49? That was where Joseph Stalin, decided to blockade West Berlin because he wanted to take control of it totally. And so the West did a airlift where they flew in, airplanes to bring in supplies to save West Berlin. It went on for, I think, 10 months or something like that. And so Stalin eventually gave in, but the West afterwards did not trust the Soviets and Stalin anymore. And so that led to a big split, East-West. And so the West formed a military alliance in 1949, which was called NATO, North Atlantic Treaty Organization. And so all these countries joined it. The U.S., Canada, and most of Western Europe got in it. And it was created as a deterrent to prevent maybe the Soviets in Eastern Europe from attacking them. Now, I think I told you that they also created their own version, which was the Warsaw Pact, 1955, which was an alliance of all those Eastern European countries I told you with the Soviets. So East Germany was in it, Czechoslovakia, Yugoslavia, Poland, Romania, Hungary, and I think Albania. Those are all the countries that were in it. So I think it had 8 of them in it, I think, with the Soviets included. What was the Second Red Scare? That was a period where there was a fear of communism spreading, not just in the world, but in America. And I think in America, they have that so-called McCarthyism, where they started, accusing people of communism and so on. And people were often put on trial, like HUAC, and the McCarthy hearings, where people were accused of communism, and people often would take the Fifth Amendment, to avoid persecution, but it, made you look guilty. And yeah, the Rosenbergs, they were outed out, who were seen as Soviet spies. They were executed in 1953. Alger Hess trial, I think around 1950. So you had all these kind of things kind of going on. And people started to talk about the domino theory, about the fact that, basically if one area, like say in Asia, goes communist, it's all going to go communist. And so people start thinking about that idea that we might have to intervene forcefully with military force. Let's see. What new communist state forms in 1949? Of course, you had the People's Republic of China formed, which was caused by the Chinese Civil War, where Republican Chinese fought the Communist Chinese. And what happened was Chiang Kai-shek was forced out of China. He was forced to flee to Taiwan, if you know that. And so the leader of China, Mao Zedong, took power and, of course, created a communist China, which it still is today. So in the last 70 years, I guess, China has remained a communist country. What was the Korean War? The Korean War was like one of the first major hot wars that was fought in the Cold War. It was kind of like a proxy war between the communist and non-communist forces. One side you had China, Soviets, and North Korea. And on the other side you had UN, South Korea, and the United States. And what were some causes of the outcome of the Korean War? The Korean War was caused by the fact that the Japanese evacuated from the peninsula after World War II. And Korea was split into two states. If you remember correctly, at the 38th parallel, you had North Korea, led by Kim Il-sung. And then you had South Korea, which was led by Syngman Rhee. And anyway, U.S. backed South Korea, Soviets backed North Korea. And as you know, Kim Il-sung and North Korea eventually invaded South Korea, I think around June, July 1950. It caused, of course, Korean War to break out. And so what happened was the United Nations intervened, and the United States put up like 90% of the forces, of the UN forces, to back South Korea and save it. And the UN commander that was head of the forces from 1950 to 51 at least was Douglas MacArthur, who was brought in from Japan, who saved them. But as you know, what happened later, the Chinese entered the war in 1950-51. That caused the war to stalemate. So Korea never really was a finished war. It was a stalemate war by 53. And the two countries are still divided at 38th parallel. What new super bomb did the U.S. Soviets develop in the 1950s? That was, of course, the hydrogen bomb, which was first tested in the Pacific. And the guy that designed it was Edward Teller. He was a Hungarian-American physicist. And this bomb was like 1,000 times more powerful than the one that Oppenheimer developed. It was more of a fusion bomb. What was the Stalinization? That was where, after Stalin died in 1953, there was a relaxation of tensions on the Soviet Union. They began to kind of liberalize things. They got rid of a lot of Stalin's hardliner policies. They opened up the gulags and all that. And who took over the Soviet Union when Stalin died in 1953? Nikita Khrushchev. He took over. He was ruler for around 10 years. And under him, he tried to reach out to the West, but it was still kind of a lot of tension under him because of various incidents that happened during the Cold War, the late 50s and early 1960s. What was the Suez Crisis in 1956? That was where Britain, France, and the state of Israel invaded the Sinai Peninsula, and they seized the Suez Canal because they didn't want the Republic of Egypt to nationalize it, which Gamal Nasser did this, if you know about it. And so it almost brought on World War III because the Soviet Union got angry about this. And they threatened to intervene if those three powers did not withdraw their forces. And so after that, the Soviets began backing a bunch of these Arab states in the Middle East. And so that helped to lead to a lot of the Arab-Israeli wars. That'll be later. And eventually the United States will back, of course, Israel, eventually, especially by 1973. What was the Hungarian Revolution of 1956? It was basically this revolution that broke out in October, November 1956 because of de-Stalinization. And the Hungarians decided they wanted to revolt against the Soviet system that had been in power. And so the revolution lasted about 2 weeks before Khrushchev eventually sent forces back in and crushed it. And Khrushchev realized that if he would have let this revolution take off, it would have probably led to the collapse of the Soviet Union and all that. And that would have been maybe the end of the Cold War with that. But the West couldn't do anything about it. And so a lot of Hungarians were killed or sent to prison after that. What famous wall was built starting under Nikita Khrushchev? That was the Berlin Wall, which was built in 1961, which basically surrounded West Berlin and prevented people from escaping to the West. I noticed there's something missing in the question there. I did want to add one in there that I don't see in the list. Actually, two I need to add, but they also had the U-2 incident. And that was an incident in the Cold War that was very famous, which happened on May 1st, 1960. That was where a U-2 spy plane in the United States was shot down over the Soviet Union. They captured the pilot, which was Francis Gary Powers, and that basically caused a lot of tensions between us and the United States, because it looked like for a while we were going to become more friendly to him because Khrushchev had visited the United States, but that caused things to get worse. Who was Fidel Castro? Castro was this Cuban that eventually overthrew the Batista government in the so-called Cuban Revolution that lasted from 1953 to 59. And Castro eventually was discovered that he decided to embrace communism, Marxism, and all that, and so he allied Cuba with the Soviet Union. So this created a lot of tensions between the United States and Soviet Union during basically the Cold War era. And so if you know what happened was in April of 1961, under John F. Kennedy, they tried to oust Castro with the so-called Bay of Pigs invasion, which was mostly, I think, backed by some anti-Castro Cubans, and it failed. And so Castro remained in power. Then in 1962, what happened next was the United States discovered that the Soviet Union had placed missiles in Cuba, like maybe nuclear missiles. And so that created the Cuban Missile Crisis, which lasted from October to November of 1962. And this became one of the major peak events of the Cold War because there was this big standoff between the United States and what is Soviet Union, and it looked like World War III was going to break out. But Nikita Khrushchev eventually backed down from that. U.S. decided not to invade. They actually just, put a blockade on Cuba instead. And what happened later was that I think what happened, how they got out of it was both decided to remove their missiles. I think we had missiles in Turkey and they had missiles in Cuba. And so we removed our missiles for their missiles. And so we were able to avoid basically World War III. Also, they had the Vietnam War. That was, of course, another conflict that was very famous also during the Cold War. The Vietnam War, of course, was a hot war that broke out in what is Vietnam. It was part of the so-called Indochina War, which went back to 1945 and ended in 1975. It was caused by mostly the French. The French in Indochina, tried to take it over. But what happened was the Viet Minh, which were led by Ho Chi Minh, eventually defeated, I think around 1954, the French at Dien Bien Phu. And so that battle forced the French out. And so later what happened, the United States came in and began supporting Vietnam, South Vietnam, because Vietnam was split in half, remember, North Vietnam, South Vietnam. North Vietnam was led by Ho Chi Minh, who was the president of North Vietnam. And then South Vietnam, of course, was backed by the United States, of course. Now, they go split the 17th parallel if you want to know that that's important about that. What was the Gulf of Tonkin resolution? That was a resolution that gave Lyndon B. Johnson authority to use military force to aid South Vietnam, attack North Vietnam, bomb it, use forces. And it was caused by the Gulf of Tonkin incident where supposedly 2 American destroyers were attacked by North Vietnamese gunboats. And so that's how we got in the war, 1964-65. I talked about the domino theory, but the domino theory was this belief that basically if one area of Asia fell, it would all fall. And so people were concerned in the United States that if South Vietnam fell, that all of Southeast Asia would fall and become communist. Who were the Viet Cong? I don't know if I went into that, but the Viet Cong were these communist guerrillas that fought in South Vietnam. And so the Vietnam War was a very difficult war because of the fact that the front lines were everywhere. You didn't know where the enemy was going to be. Vietnam also had a lot of mountains and jungle, which made it very difficult. And so you didn't know where the Viet Cong or the NVA was, North Vietnamese Army, and all that. And so Vietnam was a war that struggled on for years. And eventually, as you know, we lost the war. I know we got out in 1973. I know Tet Offensive was the peak of it in 1968 and all that. But eventually, the North Vietnamese invaded the South Vietnamese in 1975, and eventually it fell. Détente was that. Détente was in the 1970s. It was kind of like the end part of the Cold War. And what happened was in the 1970s, there was a kind of an easing of tensions between the United States and the Soviet Union. The word détente means relaxation. And you had things like both sides started signing like nuclear weapons treaties. Like they had the SALT I agreements, I think, that were big. And all that they had. The Helsinki Accords, I think, was another thing that was big in détente as well. Then you have Leonid Brezhnev. He was the ruler of the Soviet Union, the second longest reigning. And as you know, he had the Brezhnev doctrine that he had, where the Soviet Union basically thought they could basically intervene somewhere if they thought communism was threatened. So that's what led to Prague Spring, in 1968 in Czechoslovakia, where there was an attempt to make reforms. Brezhnev intervened, of course, and stopped that. And then Afghanistan, 1979 to 80, you have the Soviets went into Afghanistan because the capital Kabul, which is the capital of Afghanistan, was threatened. And so that started the Soviet-Afghan war that they think may have caused, they think, the end of the Soviet Union and all that. What were causes of why the Soviet Union collapsed in the 1980s and 90s? A lot of it was several things. One was Ronald Reagan came in, who was president of the United States in the 1980s, so 1981 to 89. And what he did, he started his arms race with the Soviet Union, like the Star Wars program and all that. And that helped hurt the Soviets right there. Also, you had the Soviet-Afghan war that was going on as well. Also, democracy, the idea of capitalism. Those were ideas that were becoming big, in Eastern Europe, in Russia. And so people wanted to move away from communism and all of that. So those all kind of played a major role in why, the Cold War eventually ended. What wall in 1989 was torn down, signaling the end of the Cold War? That was the Berlin Wall, which they started, opening up in December of 1989. And then 2 years later, actually, I'm sorry, in 1990, you had, of course, Germany reunified. Republic of Germany, of course, comes back together as one state. You have that issue happened too. And then, of course, the big thing that happened in the end, of course, at the end of the Cold War was the fact that the Soviet Union in December of 1991 collapsed and broke up. And then, of course, that leads into, the post-Cold War era, of course, that follows that we're, of course, in now as a whole. So those are all the different, historical topics that are, of course, going to be on the exam. Like I said, if you have any, comments, questions, about this review or any other question about anything else, let me know. Of course, I think most of you know my email address if you need to contact me for some reason. So that's it pretty much for this little review. And don't forget, you do have some assignments still out there that you got. I think you got that World War I one you got to finish, I know. Also, this weekend, you've got the Veterans Project due also as well. Finals will run, by the way, until May 7th. I'll have it up. There will be no makeup after that. So if you miss it for some reason, of course, you can't make it up. But, of course, a bunch of you will be exempt. I'm kind of still working on this right now, but I'm going to kind of work on who's exempt. I'll kind of have a list coming up in announcements that I'll have. I'm kind of waiting for this last final, Canvas quiz to close out. So that's it for the semester. I hope everybody has, a great summer coming up overall. And maybe I'll see you on campus, eventually. So y'all take care and have a great summer, like I said.